My name is Carol Birkin, and I'm going to talk to you today about the role that women played, or the many roles that women played in the American Revolution and the fight for independence. Most of us were raised in school with this version of the revolution. First, a group of very well-educated and talented men in the colonial assemblies and colonial governments rose up and protested British policy, and they wrote erudite treatises on the rights of Englishmen, and then when England wouldn't agree, they decided that they would rebel, and they formed an army, and they fought for 8 years, and then they created a government, and we all lived happily ever after. They were all men all the time. Where were the women? It's a bizarre question to have to ask, considering that the American Revolution was a home front war, a war that lasted 8 years, fought in towns and villages and cities, actually in people's backyards, on their farms. And there's only two explanations for the sense we have that women didn't know what was going on or didn't care. I always picture them walking out of their house to hang up their laundry, and there's a battle going on in their yard, and they don't even notice. They hang up their sheets and they go back into the house. Now, either they were all on Xanax, or they were all catatonic. Well, the answer is that they simply weren't included in most of the history books until 1980, which is really a rather shocking thing to admit. Throughout most of the 20th century, the history of the revolution was the history of generals, noble soldiers, Patrick Henry saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," John Adams, and every once in a while you'd get a little mention of Abigail Adams, who said, "Remember the ladies." No one was really sure what that meant. Well, I want to talk to you today about a very different aspect of the war, which is the aspect in which women were major participants. And it begins as early as the Stamp Act. The men did protest in the colonial assemblies against the law, but the English were not very interested in their protest. What did they care what a bunch of colonial yokels had to say? They needed money and they were going to raise it. The Americans got very clever and they said, "That's the way you feel about it. We're going to boycott your goods." Now, they didn't say boycott because that word wasn't invented until the 19th century. They had to say non-importation and non-consumption, but the idea was the same. We're not going to buy any English goods. We're not going to drink any of your tea. We're not going to buy any of your cloth, and we'll show you. Well, that really worked. But the question that ought to be in your mind is, who was it who made the boycott work? And the answer was women. It was women who bought the tea and bought the cloth. And women rose up and were politicized almost overnight. It was up to them to make sure that that boycott worked, and they made sure. They picketed merchants' shops if the merchants tried to sell British goods. One of the newspapers in Massachusetts recorded that the women marched in martial array, far better than our militia has ever marched around that store. They also began to whip out spinning wheels, which no one had used in years. I don't know if any of you have ever tried spinning, but it's probably the single most boring activity on earth. I tell my students the only thing more boring is watching bass fishing on ESPN. Women hated it. They made no bones about hating it, and as soon as British cloth was available, they stopped spinning and they bought cloth. Well, now in 1765, 1766, 67, they stopped buying English cloth. They whipped out those spinning wheels, and sometimes 100 women would gather on the lawn of a minister's home, and they would spin what they called Liberty cloth. Now that tells you that they understood that this was a political action. They called themselves the Daughters of Liberty. So right away we begin to see that the revolution was extremely radical in that it politicized women overnight. It was because of the women's boycotts that these laws were repealed. Women in New York City, being New York City types, published in the newspaper a statement that said, "Any fiancé who dares to try to put a stamp on the marriage certificate, we will refuse to marry you." There were women in South Carolina and in North Carolina who published in the newspaper. Now, women's names never appeared in the newspaper unless it was an obituary. But all of a sudden in Massachusetts, in North Carolina, women in Pennsylvania, women are publishing statements signed by a whole group of women saying, "We, the daughters of liberty, protest against this infringement of American rights. And we will not consume tea, and we will not buy cloth, and we will not buy chocolate until these hated laws are repealed." And they signed their names. Conservative men were horrified. They thought, this is what protest leads to. It leads to the world being turned upside down. Women publishing articles in the newspaper. And the women were attacked in the newspaper, and they responded in kind. When a group of men in Philadelphia opposed women speaking out, a group of women wrote back and addressed their protest to the little foplings, that is, the foolish, unmasculine men who would dare to challenge their patriotism. In North Carolina, a group of very elite women in Edenton got together and signed a statement and very explicitly said, "We are doing this of our own accord. We're not doing this because our husbands told us to. We're not doing this because this is what our husbands think. We're doing this because we believe in American liberty." In England, a man read about this and he wrote sneeringly to his brother in America, "Is there a female Congress in Edenton too?" Well, no. But it was clear that all across the country, women were becoming aware of what was going on politically. One of the young women in New York wrote, "We commenced perfect statesmen." And so instead of talking about children and knitting and linens, they talked about politics and they followed politics.